It's a truly wonderful honor to receive this award, and I'm very grateful to those who nominated me and those who decided to give me the award. I also wanted to thank my many colleagues and friends here at the university, in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and in my home department of philosophy for their support throughout the years. And most of all, though none of my family are here, I want to extend a very heartfelt thanks to them for giving me love and support over these last 17 years that I've been a university professor. So I faced the daunting challenge of trying to explain to non-specialists in about 20 minutes what it is I do. This is what I've come up with, so bear with me. So there's one tradition in thinking about language. It goes back many centuries, in which you think about a language as a system of symbols that have abstract features, sound features, and meaning features. So you can think about phonemes and nouns and verbs, and then formal rules that apply to those parts and put them together into larger complexes, up to an unlimited number of them. So if you think about language this way, you might think of English as being comparable to an algebra, right? A mathematical system of a certain sort. A competing perspective thinks about language as nothing like something mathematical, but instead an activity, a practice, right? A social interaction. It's something that we do. It's stating and asking and getting married and naming ships, right? So insofar as you're going to have an analogy here, it would be like a folk dance. That's what language is like. These seem to be deeply incompatible traditions. It's hard to imagine how you could put together a view of language as being idealized, abstract, in fact not even existing in the physical world, as mathematical systems don't, and on the other hand being concrete activities. And at the heart of what I do is a kind of vision of language as being simultaneously a linguistic system and a kind of linguistic action, and these things being tied together by knowledge of language. So the idea is, here's this abstract system, it's like an algebra, okay? But individual people know those abstract rules. And they take their knowledge of those abstract rules and put that together with a whole bunch of other stuff, beliefs and desires and cultural knowledge and knowledge about the particular context, and that gives rise to specific actions, right? And so knowledge of language is the bridge that allows us to bring together what appear to be long-standing and deeply opposed positions on the nature of language. So my slogan, going back to my first book, Back in the Mists of Time, is language is, by equal measures, a system of symbols which we know and use. And that kind of sums up my philosophy of language. Now, if you think about language as multifaceted in this way, a pressing question emerges quite immediately, and that is, what's the contribution of the knowledge of the system to particular linguistic actions, right? How much is contributed by what you know about the language? How much is contributed by other beliefs and desires that you have? How much is contributed by the social and physical world around you, right? So let me give you 3 examples. If I say, he bought that, right? That sound pattern on its own isn't about any particular person and not about any particular thing. And in order to understand it, your knowledge of the system has to be complemented by knowledge of the speech context, so you can figure out who's he and what's that, right? So for instance, he bought that, I might point at Michael Milday and at this expensive pen that I'm holding, that he's holding, all right? And then what I state in that specific case is about Michael Milday to the effect that he bought the pen, Okay? So here's a case in which knowledge of the language is complemented by knowledge of particular circumstantial facts that allow understanding. Right? Here's another example that is one of my all-time favorites. It derives from Paul Grice. So suppose a student asks me for a letter of recommendation for grad school, and I write the following. Mr. X has very neat handwriting and usually arrives on time for class. Yours, Robert J. Stainton, Distinguished University Professor. Okay? Now think about what knowledge of the system gets you. What knowledge of the system gets you is that Mr. X has neat handwriting and usually arrives on time for class, which is a very good thing, right? But the action performed goes well beyond that. Okay? The action performed is me saying, for heaven's sakes, don't admit this dude. Okay? And so my question is, how much of that linguistic action comes from knowledge of the system, and how much of that linguistic action comes from other places, right? One final example I want to give you, because I actually wrote a book about this whole topic, if you can imagine such a thing, is suppose I hold this up and I say, from France, right? Or I hold up a letter and I say, from Chomsky, right? Or I look at Michael and go, nice shoes, okay? These are all cases in which I use something which is less than a full sentence, right? From the point of view of the system, and yet such that I get across a complete thought, right? So the linguistic action is fully propositional. It's something true or false. Right? Whereas what the system assigns, or so I argue in this book, is something much more reduced than that. And so the contribution of knowledge of the system is actually relatively small in this case compared to the full action. Okay? The next thing I want to turn to is when I'm asking this question, this pressing question about what's the contribution of the system, knowledge of the system, to usage, I think one of the things that's most distinctive about my approach is the broad evidence base that I draw on. So I do draw on traditional philosophy of language, examples like Grice's example of Mr. X has neat handwriting and the example of he bought that. But I also draw on theoretical, let me start with this, history of philosophy of language. This is a recent interest of mine in collaboration with several colleagues here at Western. So rather to my surprise, as someone who was trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in which it seems like philosophy started in or around 1940, there's a huge, long history of philosophical work on language. And in fact, it turns out that that debate I started off with about is language an abstract system or is it a kind of activity goes all the way back to the Greeks. Right? And so recently I've been drawing on work from history of philosophy of language to address my key question. Also theoretical linguistics. So in looking at the sub-sentence cases, I make use of work on comparative linguistics and on formal syntax and semantics and on language processing and even some computer modeling stuff. You know, I happily draw from, and this is the last thing, any area in cognitive science. And in the last decade or so, I've been very fortunate to work with a group of clinicians who do actual research on autism spectrum disorder, and I have been drawing on their results to also try and address the question of what's the contribution of the system to understanding language and context. And here the inference goes like this. Just as you can find out what different parts of the heart do by looking at people who have heart problems, you can find out what the contribution of different parts of the mind is to linguistic understanding by looking at language deficits. And so I've been drawing on evidence from language deficits, especially understanding in autism spectrum disorder, to try and answer this larger question. So what's different about my view then is an ecumenical theoretical vision. Language isn't just a system, it isn't just a body of knowledge, it isn't just a kind of usage, it's all of those things by equal measures. And an ecumenical methodology that draws happily from philosophy, both contemporary and historical, and from the empirical sciences. And that's me. And then I wanted to give you some results from some field work that I was doing in Peru during my sabbatical. That is the largest rainbow trout that my guide had ever seen out of that river. And yes, we put it right back. Thank you very much.